Hello and welcome. I'm Morag and you're tuning in to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast. My guest today is author, climate activist, regenerative farmer, and tiny gardener. She's also an ambassador for regenerative agriculture with the Rodale Institute. Acadia Tucker was actually my very first guest on this podcast. We explored themes in her first two books, which were Growing Perennial Foods, a field guide for raising resilient herbs, fruits and vegetables, and also her second book, Growing Good Food, a citizen's guide to backyard carbon farming. I'm delighted to welcome Acadia back to the show to talk about her latest book, Tiny Victory Gardens, Growing Food Without a Yard. We get super practical in this chat because I know it's something that so many people are keen to learn about, particularly if you're renting. So every episode of this show is hosted and sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute, the host of the globally recognised Permaculture Educators program. The intro music is arranged and played by my very talented friend and neighbour Kim Kirkman, and the sound is edited by my fabulous niece Rhiannon Gamble. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands from which I'm speaking with you, the Gubbi Gubbi, and pay my deep respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to recognise their ability to care for this land, the waters and biodiversity for so many thousands of years. So let's dive in. I hope you enjoy this practical tiny garden conversation as much as I did, and make sure to check out the show notes for links to Acadia's books, more information about the work she does, a copy of the transcript, and more information about our work at the Permaculture Education Institute. Oh, and make sure to subscribe so you get notification of these weekly podcast episodes, and leave us a lovely review. It really does help the bots to find our little podcast. And I'd love for you to share this with a friend. Well, it's my absolute delight to welcome back to the show, actually, the person who was the very first guest on my podcast. I don't know if you knew that was your honour at the time. Acadia Tucker. Acadia Tucker is a regenerative farmer, author, climate activist, environmentalist, based in Maine in the United States. And we're here today to talk about your new book. Well, it's probably been out for a little while now. It came out this year, didn't it, sometime, Acadia? When did it get released?
It came out this spring, actually.
This spring, okay. And for people who are in different parts of the world, spring would be which month?
It's funny because I should know this exactly, but around March, April, May.
Oh, okay. So earlier this year.
That's a very good point, though.
And it was called Tiny Victory's Garden, Grow Good Food Without a Yard, which I think is an absolutely brilliant topic to be exploring because of, particularly, I know here in Australia, people in lockdown have been, trying to bring their food as close to home. Your other books have been about more outside gardening, and you are also a regenerative agriculture ambassador with the Rodale Institute. So your experience is kind of spanning from the farm. You were an organic market gardener before, and you talk about backyard carbon farming, and now you've gone into the tiny gardens. What brought you into the tiny gardens before we start talking about what they are and how they are?
That's a great question. I mean, as I've kind of gone along this journey of, more, getting out there and speaking to people and informing people and trying to motivate people to grow their own food, I started to realize there's like a huge part of the population that couldn't participate. And that I wasn't addressing. And I realized those are the people, who don't have a yard, whether it's in an apartment or maybe they're renting and they're not allowed to have a garden. There's just so many people out there that are passionate about food and regenerative food that, I was kind of missing the ship. So I wanted to write a book that could be inclusive to absolutely everyone and kind of address those people that I was leaving out of the conversation.
Yeah, that's really great. And I know too, just before we press the record button, we were talking too about how there's been a lot of movement going on in the world, people moving out of the cities or people being stuck in the cities and people jumping, moving around because of the changing of the, real estate
market, that there are a lot more people, I think, who are in this either transition mode or just still, trying to find a place, getting started. So I think, this idea of tiny gardens being something that you can just, even if you're not settled yet, you can kind of get started now. And I love that immediacy of it, and that we can really start to kind of be growing more healthy food, because that's something that we need more right now too, in particular, to keep us healthy and strong. So
absolutely. And I think it's not only healthy in body, but healthy in mind, right? Especially when we're dealing with kind of this kind of tumultuous time. For me, gardening indoors has given me, or in containers has given me, just like that little bit of zen of my day. Something that's larger than yourself that you can focus on, that can kind of help wash away all that fear and anxiety.
Yeah, and there's something also about having, you just mentioned indoors. I know it's indoors and outdoors, but something about having plants indoors, there's a difference in the air. And
it's absolutely fabulous. Yes.
Yeah. I wonder if, do you know any of the science? Because I know you're also a scientist. So do you know anything about the science of air quality with plants inside?
There is a lot open for debate in that realm. I have researched it a tiny bit, and there's definitely clear evidence that yes, plants do help to purify the air indoors. What's up for debate is just how much they do that. There's a little bit more research on too, just that mood boosting effect that they have. Just seeing that greenery, taking care of something that's living, that has some more background in the science, is just that mood elevation that you get when you're kind of living with other things.
Yeah, this one I've got behind me, I know that it's like a trendy plant, but where I live here in the subtropics, this monstera was actually something that I took a little clipping of. It actually grows wild in and around the forest here. And so I took a little clipping of it and I cultivated, and they have edible fruits. So, the monstera, it's like a fruit salad plant. So, I really enjoy having that now. Yeah.
I know.
Every now and then it drips on my head. Like... Or I leave my notes beside me here, and I've got an ink that kind of runs. So I've got to be really careful what I put beside it, because it does. It kind of it humidifies the air inside, which is kind of a nice thing as well.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I know. Normally my background is a little bit more plant centric, but as we were talking about before we hit record, I just recently moved myself, so everything's kind of in a bit of a shuffle and turmoil, and all my plants are tucked downstairs under grow lights right now, which kind of give off this kind of pinkish hue that's not very attractive for videos either. So.
Oh yeah, that's different. You're at the moment going into winter.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about tiny gardens in winter, indoors. Like, how is that? What can you grow in the winter in tiny gardens?
Yeah, so depending on what level of climate control you're comfortable with in your space, you can grow anything. So here I am in northern Maine, and I have banana trees, I have lemon and lime trees inside. I even have this gorgeous passion fruit vine that is giving me passion fruits. So you can, again, as whatever you're comfortable with in terms of heat. So for me, that's the big kind of equalizer right now in my life, where we do rely a lot on a wood stove at the moment, just to where we moved in this cabin, and it's been a little bit hard to keep tropical plants happy as the temperature's coming down. So again, it's whatever you're comfortable with. Yes, there's a level of effort involved when you're bringing plants in the home, because, they're living things. You have to take care of them. But, the sky is really the limit. And that's what I try to point out in the book. It's like, whatever you're willing to do can be done. If you're just starting out, I definitely recommend, dipping your toes in the water before you dive in. So I always say, for people who have never done it before, just start with a few kitchen herbs. You can put them in your kitchen window or wherever you have a sunny sill, and you can grow these herbs. And that kind of, for me, I always call it's like the gateway plants. Like those, once you get used to growing herbs and you love it and it's just so nice. You're like, oh, I'm making a pasta sauce. Let me clip off some oregano or rosemary or thyme. And it's fresh and it's right there. That's the hook that I think can get people excited about it. And then from there, they can grow, their own salads, their own, salsas. One of the things I like to do in this book is to point out certain recipes, plant recipes that work good in a pot. So, grow the food you want to eat. I think that it sounds very simple when you say it out loud, but so many people forget to do that, right? So I like to combine certain plants that are an ingredient, like salsa or a spaghetti planter or a salad planter, because then it's all right there, ready to go.
I love that idea. It's like a pizza pot or,
Yeah.
or a salsa pot or things grow really well that go into sort of, Thai food, with all the chilies and the spices. You can have a pot like that. And I think that's so brilliant. So it's thinking about, because often when you think about a culinary type, those plants are often from the same environment, so the same conditions work really well, it makes sense. It really makes sense. So let's just rewind a little bit. For those people, the gateway plants, you mentioned a couple, but if you were to list off, say, 5 of the easiest plants to grow in pots on your windowsill, what would they be?
I definitely start with a few of the herbs and then leafy greens. So whether like right now, it's even despite our kind of getting drafty indoors, I can grow lettuce, spinach, arugula. I can grow kale. I can grow some root crops, carrots, beets, radishes are really easy to grow indoors. And they're really quick. It's almost like immediate gratification.
Oh, they're amazing, aren't they?
Yeah. And then, it's taco night. I have fresh radishes and cilantro to garnish my tacos with. So
tell me, really, let's talk about the carrots, because I know that's one thing that, if you can grow carrots, people feel like, oh, I've done it. I've grown carrots. It's this sense of achievement, because it's something that, particularly when you're working with young kids as well, to just be able to pull out and reveal a carrot and just eat it straight from the pot is something so beautiful. So to be able to do that from a tiny garden that you've got growing on inside, what would you do to prepare a pot to grow carrots? What would be your step-by-step guide to grow carrots inside?
Yeah, well, carrots are a little bit trickier just because they take up so much underground space. So you want to make sure when you're talking about any tiny garden, your container selection is going to matter a lot. You need something that's going to fit the crop. So if you're trying to go for a tree, you're going to need a really large container. If you're going for, a carrot, you're going to have to make sure it's a deep container. You can also circumnavigate that a little bit by picking maybe carrot varieties that don't go as deep. They have some, I don't know if you've ever heard of the ox heart carrot, but it's this kind of stubby, wide carrot rather than thin and long. So you can think about, what am I growing? So what does it have to grow into? And then once you pick a suitable container, you have to fill it with soil, right? And that's kind of the big question with container gardening is, what do I use for a potting mix, right? A lot of container soils are actually soilless. And they do that for a reason. Garden soil doesn't really work that well in a container. It's filled with clay. And the drainage, soils are used to draining in all directions, up, down, sideways. The water has a lot of places for movement. When you confine that soil into a container, it can only go out those few drainage holes that you've put in the bottom. So choosing a soil mix, whether you make it your own or you purchase it, you need to make sure that it's light. It doesn't have any clay. It drains really well. And I do go quite into length in the book about, you can actually make your own, which I prefer to do because it can be really challenging to find a good potting mix. It's hard to find one. You go to your hardware store and, either it doesn't have the ingredients that you find sustainable or regenerative, or it's been sitting in that bag, baking in the parking lot for who knows how long. You open it up, it's all crusty and hard. So after the container, soil selection is really important, and I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit more. And then once you're ready to go, you just plant your seeds, and you have to keep it well watered. When you're growing, especially indoors in containers, it's kind of nice because you don't really have to deal with maybe some of the pests that you would outdoors. But one of the things when you bring things inside and maybe they don't dry as quickly or the drainage is not as good, I find that I have a little bit more issues with like molds and diseases rather than pests.
Yeah, right, because you don't have the sort of the wind going around. And I wonder, what are some of those other issues around, growing inside, you don't have pollinators, so that would be an issue. What about, you might have a windowsill that gets a couple of hours sun, but then the rest of the day you're not getting that much sun. Some things do okay with that, like herbs, but how do you deal with plants that might need longer sun time or need pollination? I guess that's why you said start with the herbs and start with the
easy.
They're okay. Exactly. They can grow in low light. They don't need pollination. They're kind of self-pollinating, and whatever the word is for that. Sorry, but I think. Yeah, what are your tips for those ones that are a little bit more challenging? So I'm glad we got the carrots sorted. That's good. We can park the carrots. Probably need to be. They take quite some time to grow, so they'll need to be a spot.
There's a level of patience involved, and especially for me with carrots, I'm like, you kind of, when you're dealing with tiny spaces, you have to weigh the pros and cons. Is this worth taking up that much space, right? So you kind of have to ask yourself these questions, and in the terms of growing things indoors that need pollination, right? So a lot of things are pollinated by the wind. So you can kind of get around that by setting up a fan. Create that wind environment. The other thing you can do too is self-pollinate. And I always joke, once someone does this for one season, for one crop, one plant, they get this newfound appreciation for our pollinators. Because if you imagine a world where you wake up and that's gone, and then this a seemingly free, invisible service goes away, it's a really, really big deal. So it allows you to gain some humility when you think about that, when you're there with your little Q-tip rubbing pollen from one flower to the other.
I mean, with all this stuff that happens in the unseen world or just around us, it's like breathing or, growing. We don't think about it. It just happens in our mind. And the same thing in nature, like we often call them ecological services. Right. That seems to be a very sort of anthropocentric view of life. We are part of nature, but often our lens doesn't allow us to see all the things that are part of our world that makes our world happen. The things underneath our feet, everything that goes on. So and a deeper appreciation of the web of life, I think, is
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of like light, right? You're saying, not everybody has a gorgeous south-facing window, especially if you're in an apartment building or wherever. Maybe there's another house blocking the sun next to you. So I do use grow lights quite a bit when I'm growing indoors. And grow lights come in all shapes and sizes, all different price points. So you really can shop around and find something that works for you. I
know nothing about grow lights. I'm always an outsider because I live in the subtropics. It's sort of.
I was going to say, you've got plenty of sunshine where you are.
Can you just, for people like me who know nothing about growing with grow lights, can you just give us like the quick 101 of how to set up a grow light system, or what is a grow, what they are, how they work, do they use lots of energy? These are all the sorts of questions that I kind of
No, grow lights have come a long way. They used to be pretty energy intensive, kind of cumbersome things, but now a lot of grow lights are made with LEDs, so they don't get hot, they don't use a lot of energy, and basically when the science comes down to it, they're trying to mimic the sun rays as much as possible, right? But it's really hard to recreate something that happens in nature. We don't fully understand all the different wavelengths of sun. So, over the years, people focus on, okay, what UV rays, or what rays of light do plants need to photosynthesize. So a lot of grow lights will focus on just a few different wavelengths, right? The best grow lights are what we call, include all of the wavelengths, or as much of the wavelengths as they can, a full spectrum light, if you will. So those are usually what I tend to gravitate towards, but they do tend to be a little bit more expensive. So I'm pretty frugal myself, so I have plenty of grow lights that just do a few of the wavelengths, and they work pretty well. There's supplemental sun coming in from the windows that I think help to beef up how they're growing. But if you're going to grow a plant in a completely dark room without windows, you definitely want to focus on that full spectrum wavelength. The other thing I'll mention about grow lights, which I did briefly say, is, they can have a presence, right? So here in Maine, it gets dark around 4:15, 4:30 right now. So in order to help my plants along, I like to leave my grow lights on till around 7 p.m., which means I have quite a long window of dark hours sitting in a house with these grow lights on, and they can throw off kind of a different hue that you're not used to, which is why I've come up here to upstairs away from the grow lights. So they can be, some people can probably find them a little bit intrusive. Again, you can get around that by, putting your plants in a tent and putting the grow lights in a tent.
Cool.
And that
also
way,
maybe in a carport, a garage or something.
Exactly. So you can kind of, if you have enough space, you can put the grow lights in a room where they're not going to bother you. But again, if you get a more full spectrum light, it tends to look like our normal light bulbs a lot more. And in that case, you're really not going to notice it at all.
Yeah. So my other question before we move to outdoor tiny gardens, my other question about indoor tiny garden growing at this scale is water. So how do you manage the water and the leakage in a way that you're not actually going to destroy your flooring in the process?
No, it's a very good question. I think, it's a hard question, right? Because on for the plant growing side of it, you want as much drainage as possible. You want as much leaky water all over the place to help your plant roots be healthy, right? But then again, you might have hardwood floor or a nice wooden countertop or windowsill that you don't want to damage. So I do rely on using those saucers that you just place under the pot, whether it's plastic or a chipped plate that I didn't want to throw out, or it could really be anything. You can also use what I like to call like the pot inside the pot technique. So you can have this really pretty decorative pot that looks gorgeous, looks great, goes with your home decor, with no drainage holes. But then you want to put a liner pot inside of that decorative pot that's going to adequately drain. And you need to use either like stones or pebbles to elevate that liner pot away from the bottom of your decorative pot, just to allow a space for that water to go.
Yeah, great. And what's your best way of watering as well? I love that idea, what you just suggested. And that's simple. It's a simple response. Thank you.
It's very simple, yeah.
So, we're not talking automatic watering system then. I was imagining you have big pots, and I think my mind was going to, I've seen lots of people doing indoor sprout production, and they have like sprinklers and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
We're not doing sprinkler systems inside. It's just simple hand pouring, I'm imagining. Yeah.
There's a lot of hand watering, but the good news is there's not as much evaporation indoors, right? Yes. Because you don't have the wind, you don't have the direct sun beating on the soil. So you water a lot less frequently. You can also do things that you would normally do outside, like utilize mulch to help your soil retain moisture. You can use decorative stone mulches, pea gravel. You can even use hay and straw like you would outside. So that's the watering, it becomes a lot less challenging when you bring it indoors. I also just like to use like just a squirt spray bottle to maybe spray the leaves, keep the humidity up if, we do run a wood stove, so it gets pretty dry. So keeping some of my more tropical plants kind of feeling humid, I do kind of spritz them about, which helps. But I have a few watering cans that I like to use. You can also use, I think people call them water stakes. I call them water stakes, but it's this bulb with a straw, and you fill it and you flip it upside down, and that slowly drains into the soil.
Yeah. Okay.
So like if I know I'm going to go away for a week or two, I want to set my plants up with some water in that regard. You can make them there's tons of DIY versions, or you can get these really ornate, beautiful blown glass ones as well.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's great to know. The other thing I was going to ask, and I just maybe we can, this is sort of a segue into the soil question that I have for you about living soil, but still sticking on the idea of the indoor plants. What do you feed your indoor plants to make sure that the sort of the food for the plants is there for them to continue to grow and thrive, and they don't start to sort of, yellow? And what do you feed your plants inside?
That is the unique challenge with container gardening, right? Because in outdoor gardens, in-ground gardens, the roots can grow and expand and find what they need a little bit better. So when you're growing in containers, you definitely have to take a little bit more care in terms of feeding your soil. So I always, if room allows, I always add compost at least twice a year to just the surface of my containers, and that helps a lot. Or if I'm repotting a plant, so say it's grown out of its current pot and I want to put it into a larger one, I use that opportunity to, again, invigorate the soil with more compost or powdered soil amendments. When I'm in a pinch and I know that, there's absolutely no more materials can fit inside this container, I'll rely on liquid fertilizers. And one of my favorite is just like a fish emulsion. But I do have to warn, it's, some of these, especially a lot of organic liquid fertilizers, have a very unique odor.
That's a very polite way of saying it.
When you bring that, and when you bring that into the home, sometimes it can be a little offensive. For example, when I first got into container gardening and researching my books and stuff and bringing a lot more plants inside my home, I just used my favorite fish emulsion fertilizer that I would use in the garden for my tomatoes, and I watered all of the plants inside. And my partner comes home and he starts, doing the nose thing, and he goes, "Oh my gosh, something's died in the walls." And he doesn't know that I fertilized all the plants. He's going over, he's smelling, he goes, "Right here, there's something dead in the walls right here." And lo and behold, my tomatoes are right under him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that would do it.
That would do it. But the nice thing is you can kind of neutralize those odors as well. So like I'll put in a few drops of like an essential oil, like lavender.
Okay.
Into the watering can with the fertilizer, and that goes a long way as neutralizing that kind of
that's interesting,
if you will. Yeah.
Would never have thought of mixing essential oils with fish emulsion. There we go. That's a top tip.
The things you do, right?
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, things you do for the plants and growing food.
Yeah.
And you know what you're saying is really entirely very straightforward and very simple steps, and there's nothing rocket science about this, is it? It's just
absolutely, and that's why I get so passionate about talking to people about it, because these are all, like you said, simple steps that you can all do. That's not crazy. It's not out of the box. It's I don't want to say easy, because I feel like when people fail, that's they're not failing because they couldn't do something easy. It's a lot more matter of fact and straightforward than I think people lead themselves to believe, because maybe they have killed a few plants in their life, or maybe they always, I hate when people say, "Oh, I have a black thumb, I can't grow anything," and they kind of use that as an offense not to try anymore, right? But there's always room for improvement. I kill plants all the time, and I'm a professional plant grower, right?
Yeah, it is about being in that playful space and experimenting with it. And when something goes wrong, to notice. So, if that plant dies, maybe tip out the soil, see what's going on in the soil, and feel its moisture. Have a look, smell the soil. Was it, see what's going on, and see if you can troubleshoot that. And it doesn't.
Exactly. And for me,
yeah, I just did a workshop the other day in the city about small gardens and getting your edible garden started. And someone came up to me at the end and said, I was a bit embarrassed to ask you during the session because I feel like a bit of a dummy, but basil, it should be really easy to grow, but it died. And I said, it's okay. It's an annual. It will die. It's like, oh, that's so, and he just like went, oh, I didn't kill it. Like there is a big, sometimes I find that, there is this sort of a gap and something, be playful with it, keep researching, keep asking other people, experiment with it. And, the joy of it is once you get a few going and a few really hardy ones happening and you start to experiment, it's just a wonderful thing.
No, for me, the best thing about growing food and gardening in general is that trial and error process. Like, oh, geez, well, that didn't work. Let me try something new. And for me, that's what's fun, because each season's different. You keep building upon what you've learned, and there's no real ceiling to that knowledge. So every growing season, every plant, it's just that opportunity to learn something new.
Yeah. And you know what I learned about bananas the other day, because I have bananas out here in my garden. And you can eat the young shoots. You can eat, obviously, the bananas and even the banana peel. You can have the green bananas. You can eat the banana flowers and all the different parts. And there was a woman in the same workshop the other day. And she said, have you ever tried the banana hearts, like the stalks, banana stems? I said, what? I'd always just use the banana trunks as, part to put on contour to help build up the soil.
Sure.
So you just peel off the edges and use that as mulch, and then you get this stem in the middle, which you can chop up and use it as a vegetable. Right. I didn't know that. I was so excited.
I've had palm hearts before, and I imagine it's very similar, but I didn't draw that connection either.
Oh, I love this possibility of always learning something new about either plants or how to grow them, or, experimenting yourself. But before we go on, though, let's sort of cycle it back. We were talking about soil and soil in pots. And one of the biggest things that I always am talking about within permaculture is about the basis of creating a thriving and abundant garden, and that grows healthy, robust food that's, resilient to all sorts of things, is having a living soil. So how do you create living soil in a pot? That's my big question for I know it's entirely possible, but what are the ways that we can do it and make sure that it continues to stay thriving? Because it's easy for life to die in a pot.
Absolutely. And that's still a question I'm figuring out how to do better and better and better. And obviously for me, in my outdoor large containers, like I would consider a raised bed a container, because your soil's confined by walls. So out in my raised beds, I absolutely know I have beautiful teeming ecosystem of life out there. It helps because it has an open bottom, right? So that soil in the container is actually in contact with the ground. So bugs, microorganisms, fungi, all that can kind of naturally colonize that container. But it gets a lot more complicated when you're talking about a container, say, indoors. So the way I try to build that same kind of regenerative living soil ecosystem is, I do rely very heavily on compost-based potting mixes. I try to avoid peat just for kind of the ecological reasons. And it's pretty inert. It doesn't offer that much. Plus it can kind of mess with your pH a little bit as well. So I rely very heavily on very heavy-based compost potting mixes. And you can do different things to kind of aerate it. You can have perlite, vermiculite. I try to use pumice stone just because it's goes through less chemical processes, and one could argue that it's kind of.
Can we just stop there and say, what is the difference between perlite, vermiculite, and pumice?
I don't know if I have the best answer for that. Basically, they're all used, right, for aeration, and some more than others, a little bit of water retention. They're all minerals from what I can speak to, but perlite and vermiculite go through these chemical processes that make them kind of puff up like a cheese puff, so that they have more surface area. Whereas pumice stone is a more naturally occurring, that's the volcanic rock that has all those air pockets kind of naturally in it. So yes, it is mined and it is dug up and it is shipped all across the world, when you're speaking environmentally about it, but it's not kind of processed in a manufactured plant, unless of course they're dyeing it or something like that. So when I can find it, and it's not always the easiest, I do rely on that for my aeration. But then that kind of living ecosystem aspect of the soil in the pods, I do use soil inoculants. So I'm actually, because the container is not open to the ground like my raised beds where they can naturally flourish, I do use, say, you can buy powdered mycelium, you can buy, any kind of cultures. So I do use mycelium the most. And like I say, you just kind of mix it into your potting mix. You want to make sure, it's not freezing or it's not too dry. You have to make the conditions right for your soil inoculants as well. There's even, you could call them tinctures of just like a whole host of different living organisms that you can just kind of include. Like you can put it in your watering can and water it into your soil. And that will kind of inoculate your soil. And then from there, it's up to you to keep feeding it. So you still need organic matter. You still need to, like I said, make those conditions tolerable for them. So that's when I do like to use mulches on top of my potted plants as well, because that, again, just like you're feeding the soil outdoors when you're mulching with anything organic, organic matter based, you can do the same for your containers. And I will have to admit, it is a big experiment, and it's hard to say if the microorganisms I introduce are living and thriving and carrying over from year after year, or if just this ritual of me inoculating my soil is keeping up a community of soil organisms within that container. There's still a lot of research that can be done, a lot of experiments that can be done. But from what I found, it really helps those potted plants flourish.
And that was what I was going to ask you next. What have you noticed between a pot that you don't do that inoculation and a pot of plants that you do add that? What's the difference?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest difference is, they just do a better job of growing. So, there's obviously more nutrient cycling and that thing's happening. But have you ever grown a house plant and, it gets so bone dry and dusty, and you go to water it and all the water just leaks out the sides immediately and it's never sinking into the soil? I find that happens a lot less when I'm trying to cultivate this living soil in containers, because it has the air pockets, it has the existing moisture, it has kind of that soil aggregates that are going to make watering your pots a lot better. So I find that it's very hard to recreate garden soil in a container.
But it keeps the condition of the soil for longer, and it keeps it. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, what you said. That makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. So I just find that, my plants are just happier. And then you have kind of these, a lot of things that the soil organisms do, we still don't really understand but there's, pest and disease defenses. There's kind of all of this stuff we don't really understand exactly yet, that cultivating a living soil can help to recreate those conditions that these plants would naturally be thriving in.
And so what kind of size pot do you recommend then for having that living system. I mean, imagine you couldn't really get much of a living system in a tiny pot. So what's that, when you're talking about tiny gardens that have living soil, what's the size we're exploring?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the easiest, like I 100% know I'm achieving this in my raised beds that are like 4x4, right? With a decent depth, 6 inches minimum. I believe it's possible in, say, like a 7 to 10 gallon pot as well, to kind of create this self-sustaining ecosystem that just takes care of itself. Once you get smaller than that, I've had, then it becomes when the smaller your pot gets, the harder it is to feed that soil, right? With compost or any other nutrients that you want to, any organic matter that you want to add to the system. So once you get to that smaller pot size, you're very limited on what you can add to that pot. It's kind of, either you're going to have to completely redo the soil and put it in new pots each, season or month or however you want to do it. But yeah, I would definitely stick to the larger, deeper containers if you're looking to experiment with really cultivating living soil in a container.
Yeah, great. I just want to come back to that point about refreshing pots. And you were saying every season or even every month, and I think possibly this is, actually repotting plants and adding more compost in, the fact that, that is the entire life or source of nutrients that the plant can access. We need to keep that in mind. So,
Right.
Is there you said a month, that's quite often.
That is, and that's more if like you're growing something from seed, right? And after you keep up potting it, because you can have a pot that's too large for a plant, right? The roots don't absorb the moisture. It can be soggy. You'll get disease or molds. So keeping a plant in the right size pot can be really important for that plant's success. So as a plant's growing, so say if I wanted to grow a tomato indoors, I'm going to start my seedling in a cell tray, very tiny, inch tray, and then I'll up pot it to a 2-inch pot, and then maybe a 4-inch pot before I put it in, a gallon pot. So each of those steps is another opportunity to introduce, say, more compost or a refresh of that soil in that container.
Yeah, great. Okay, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
So let's just step outside in terms of tiny gardens, and let's talk maybe a little bit more about growing fruit trees in pots, and thinking a bit about design, and thinking about trying to create an ecological system in a pot with a fruit tree. What have been some of your best experiments with getting fruit trees growing and fruit tree guilds growing?
So fruit trees are kind of been one of my grand experiments, right? Because for me, growing in containers allows me to grow foods that I traditionally can't grow in Maine, right? Like bananas, pomegranates, the passion fruit. So all of these things I wouldn't normally try to grow because they don't survive here. But the ability to let them grow outdoors in the summer and then bringing them indoors for the winter has opened up all these new plants that I can kind of play with and experiment with. So that's been I think by far that's my favorite benefit of tiny gardening, is the ability for me to do more with less. But in terms of, kind of creating that ecological space, say on your patio, right? I really like to use, fruit trees, for example. They're tall, they produce shade. So I like to grow more shade loving things, at the base or in pots at the base. So, I might not be able to grow lettuce on my porch throughout the summer, but with the shade of a banana tree, I can.
Yeah, great.
So it can kind of
those microclimates.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And then there's other things too you can plant for pollinators. So mixing in flowers, around my containers, in my containers of plants to kind of attract the types of bugs and the types of situations that I want for that small space.
Have you ever played with sack gardens?
Like the fabric bags?
Yeah, the fabric bags. Have you ever played with those?
Yes. And
What's
I really
your
do
tips for those? How do you?
So I really enjoy those because they really do help to cultivate that living soil environment because they allow that soil to breathe. Mm-hmm. So when you're growing in a plastic container, it can be a little bit suffocating. You're closing off that airflow and that circulation. When you grow in plastic pots, you can have more issues with drainage and soggy soil. So those fabric pots are amazing because it lets the soil breathe in a way that it normally would. They can be a little bit cumbersome because they're a bit awkward. There's not much integrity to hold all of that weight. Yeah. So I tend to fill them where I want them to be and not move them around. And they can, depending on which ones you buy, they can deteriorate. They don't last forever. So that I'm not in love with, but the price point matches, kind of its durability. The other benefit I really like to the fabric pots is, say if you're a renter, right? You can just pack up your pots into a nice little box and move to your next home. And because I think that is one of the limiting things, especially like me recently moving, having all these indoor plants. It took two pickup truckloads to kind of cart them away. But when you're growing annuals and in those fabric pots, that process of moving your garden becomes really, really pragmatic.
Yeah. And have you noticed at all the possibility of growing things to seed in a tiny garden? Or is it, because the plants are limited, do you find that the vigor of the plants is not quite enough for it to successfully go to seed, or have you been able to do that maybe in the larger pots again?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And to be honest, I'm always just so excited. I'm like, oh, I have a carrot. I'm not going to wait for it to go to seed. I'm going to eat it.
Yeah.
So I've never allowed myself the patience to let things go to seed. For more annuals, like say arugula, it's pretty prone to going to seed as soon as it's unhappy. So sometimes growing in a container can make it go to seed faster.
Yeah.
Same with lettuces and annuals and stuff like that. But when it comes to biennials and perennials, I have to admit, I do not have the patience.
No, not for those ones. That would be quite something, wouldn't it? And all the extra space to take off, and they get massive.
Yeah.
As well. Well, that would be good for the ecological. They'd be attracting lots of beneficial insects as well, I suppose. Yeah,
absolutely. So there are some herbs, like say like my cilantro, every spring, I plant it at the base of, trees, or if I have a larger container and I just have some extra room, cilantro is one of the things that I plant quite regularly. And that always goes to seed. And I've started to leave, I used to cut the bolt off and try to coax it along a little bit longer, but now I find myself letting it go to flower. Yeah. And now that just becomes another component that's going to attract a pollinator to come.
Yeah, and they're just a buzz. Mine have just finished at the moment. They're just getting all the seeds are drying, and I'm just waiting to sort of let them scatter out in the garden and bring some into the kitchen as well. It's just such a beautiful plant to grow, and such an easy one. So
it is.
Let's talk a little bit more about then design. So design of your balcony. Say if you've just got a small balcony, what would be the first things you would think about in terms of setting the layout of a balcony garden to get the most food possible out of that area?
Yeah, you always need to look at where is your light source, right? Before you consider anything, you need to figure out where's that sunniest corner, where's that shadiest corner, so that you can place plants appropriately, right? You don't want to be fighting nature, you want to be working with it. So at any point you can find yourself working with nature, it's going to make your job a lot easier. But then I like to kind of employ these design principles that say a florist might use, right? And it's kind of this cheesy cliche saying, but they always say you want to aim to thrill, fill, and spill. So you always want that thriller plant, whether it's the tall or the most attractive one. That's kind of like your centerpiece. And you can view that as a single large pot or a cluster of smaller pots, right? We're not tied to just being one container. It can be also how you arrange your containers. But you always want that one thrill, that one center tall piece. And then around that, you have your fill. So, typically an example would be my thriller could be, a bean plant crawling up a trellis. And then around the base of that bean plant, I could plant carrots and lettuce. They're kind of fluffier. They take up space on that middle tier. And then you can eke out the last square inch of every container by growing things that flop over the edge or the spillers. Tomatoes can do that, beans, peas, certain herbs can do that as well. Cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, if you really want to, they just need their roots in the soil, but they do all their growing outside of the container. So you can really maximize your space and do it in a way that's actually, quite attractive.
I love that. I've not heard that. Not being a florist, the thrill and spill. It's so easy to remember, but it gives you that.
It is, and again, it's using you're thinking vertically as well as horizontally. So you want to use every, tier of space that you have, and it is very aesthetically pleasing. And then my favorite benefit is, you can really maximize the space you have.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, on a balcony too, what would be your best advice for people doing compost on a balcony? So we know we need to keep the soil, adding compost. So how can we do compost without having a big yard or that kind of thing? What's your ideas on that?
Yeah, there's two methods. There's like a microbial composting method. I can't remember the name off the top of my head right now, which is terrible, which uses a much smaller space. But I love to promote worm composting in small spaces. So you can just have your worm bin. And there's a few steps, definitely research it a little bit before you just dive in, because they are living creatures. And you want to make sure you're treating them appropriately. But once you kind of set up your bin, which usually can be a plastic tote with holes drilled into it, you get your carbon source in there, like shredded newspaper or, things like that. And then you can start adding in your food waste. And depending on how many worms you have will determine the quickness that all these things get broken down. But then as a result, you have this beautiful worm casting, deep, rich compost. It doesn't smell. It doesn't take up a lot of space. It's easy just to sprinkle onto your plants. You can store it under your kitchen counter if it's cold outside. It kind of really opens up composting to, a tiny space.
Yeah,
I think people would imagine like that tumbler inside their living room, and like, no, that's not what you have to do.
No, because that's the thing, isn't it? That the worms operate in a dark space. As long as they've got enough warmth to keep going, they don't want to be obviously too hot or too cold. That nice warmth that is comfortable for us. So if it's a comfortable temperature for us, it will also be a comfortable temperature for the worms.
Yeah, and I think the tricky thing for people when they start vermiculture or worm composting is a lot of people might tend to overfeed their worms, so they put in more food than that can easily break down, and that's when you're going to get like a bad smell or maybe fruit flies. So just knowing how much you can add, and then worms can be picky. There are some foods they don't love. So if you realize that you're putting stuff in the bin that isn't getting eaten, it's a pretty good indication that, hey, these guys don't really like your lemon peels. So maybe you shouldn't put them in there anymore.
Yeah. And so again, that experimental approach and being in observation and noticing that. I mean, a trick that it's not really a trick, but a tip that I have to always, when I'm using my worm farm, is that the last thing that I put on the top is either hay or ripped up paper or something. So when you open up the lid, you're not seeing all the food scraps, because that's when you end up getting the fruit fly type thing. So if you put something in, then you've got either other leaves or paper or something on top of that. Yeah.
Or even like I like to use the like wood chips that you would put in like a chicken pen.
Okay.
And for their bedding, like it's just really thin wood shavings that is just a nice source of carbon.
Yeah.
That if you don't have newspapers to shred up, you can easily get it at your hardware store.
Yeah, and a blanket on the top. So I most of my clothes are all compostable clothes. So when something kind of my kids completely go through something, it just goes into the worm farm, like even sheets, bed sheets. So when they're finished, that becomes the blanket on top that just keeps everything a bit more moist and then they end up eating that. And I've been able to pull out the elastic around the edge of the bed sheet, and then everything else is gone.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Well, that's the thing about even in a small space like this, you could get this far more circular economy, this nutrient cycling happening, even for things that you don't necessarily think of. So, if compostability becomes a key criteria of what you bring into your home, then through these systems, you can get that cycle happening. It can actually go into your food growing. And when you think about, I suppose, that you're going to be eating it, you also choose differently what you bring in.
Sure, right? You are what you eat. Exactly. No, I think that's fantastic. And I think the biggest critique that I hear from people is, oh, I just don't have that much space, right? And there is an element of creativity you need when you're trying to design a tiny garden, specifically when it becomes indoors, right? You're sharing your space with this. So people say, oh, well, I don't even have room for a bag of soil, or, that there are space constraints that make it a little bit more difficult. And I always just like to point out, with a little creativity, you can solve all sorts of problems. So, oh, you don't have room for a bag of soil. I've had people dump out a bag of soil into those really thin Tupperware totes that, are meant to slide under your bed. And you can store your soil under your bed. There's just outside the box creative solutions that if you're willing to make them, they'll definitely present themselves.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Wonderful. I was also just thinking too about being creative about use of space. I wonder about, we also have the possibility of using, wall gardens. If you've got a wall that's facing towards the sun, you can have, things attached to the wall, and they come in all different shapes and sizes, homemade ones or prefab ones. And then I wonder whether you've experimented with hanging pots at all with edibles. So you get the ones coming down from the roof as well.
Absolutely. I haven't done hanging pots indoors. I think my partner would be a little...
It's like, now you're going too far.
It's a lot. I think if he's bumping his head up, hanging pots. But no, I've definitely used I've experimented with, last year's plant hanger. I've done tomatoes, I've done cucumbers that way, I've done peas and beans that way. I will have to stress though, peas and beans, while they do spill quite nicely, they're always trying to grow up. So if they'll find anything that they can attach to start going the direction they want. But it works beautifully. You can do it with strawberries as well. It works really well with. And again, once you'll realize you have a lot more space when you start to view any space as a growing space, right? And that's including this vertical space that normally we never really consider that much when you have a lot of in-ground space. So, there's the tabletop that you can fit as many planters on as well. But yeah, like you said, there's a beam above that table. I can hang a plant from that as well. So
one thing that I've experimented too with hanging pots is even sweet potatoes. You plant a sweet potato in there and it will spill out over with all the leaves. And the leaves are like a spinach. So, even regardless of how much sweet potato root you get, you can be eating. The more you trim, the more you get. And so
absolutely
wonderful possibilities for all
kinds. They're really pretty leaves too. Speaking from that floral design aspect too, like a lot of potted flower arrangements include some sort of sweet potato vine because it's that nice spilling element.
Yeah, that's right. I've never heard about that either before. Maybe I might start taking that floristry. It sounds like just. But it's true though. I often go out into my garden and I pick a whole lot of flowering vegetables or herbs or natives and make bouquets and bring them in. And, we can use those as garnishes. So you could actually have pots in the middle of your table, which you could be trimming from and having as garnishes. Why not,
Can you imagine, we just had our big Thanksgiving holiday here in the US. And my dream is to have like that center table arrangement be, the herbs or the garnish or something that people can just clip right there and add to their plates, which is be really special.
Yeah, that's really nice. There's a Christmas idea. If anyone's listening to this before Christmas, table decorations that are edible pots of herbs, and you just leave some scissors around the edges so people can do their own clippings. I think it's fantastic.
I love that.
Yeah. Look, there's been so many tips that you've suggested here. It's absolutely brilliant. I mean, one of the things that all of your books do are really about calls to action for being more ecological. It's about climate action. It's about what we can do in our own homes and our gardens and in our food choices, but also, as we're talking now, right in our home with the tiny guts. I think it's absolutely fantastic. There's a quote that I read of yours. It's talking about this is all about gardening as if our future depended upon it. And maybe as a way to sort of close up, just want to talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of my big passions about growing food and gardening is that soil's ability to store carbon, right? And obviously that gets turned on its head a little bit when we're talking about tiny gardens and victory gardens, because they don't quite have that power. But what I think is interesting about growing in a small space is one, learning how to grow your own food, right? Like that's a really powerful skill that I think a lot of people would benefit from practicing on a daily basis, right? So, if you can imagine a dystopic future where, maybe the sun's covered up, or maybe it's too hot to grow food outside, you have this climate, this indoor climate that you can utilize. And I think, it sounds horrible to say, but I think we will need to lean on that a little bit more in the future. And without, cultivating these skills on how to do that, you lose a lot of that self-reliance, right? So for yourself and for your community to develop these skills has a lot of power and weight behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And, we're hearing talk even here on some of the outskirts of Sydney, one of the cities in Australia, that 50 degrees in summer is going to be kind of a new normal. I mean, that's horrific, absolutely horrific. So,
right.
How could you possibly grow food there? And like you're saying, having those skills and making it a new normal, that growing food is something that we do know how to do, and we can do it in really awkward situations or highly urbanized situations. Here in Australia, we have possibly, I think it's well over 80%, maybe 85% of people who live in cities, and more in smaller apartments. So these tiny food gardening skills are really quite essential. So, thank you so much for writing this book. I mean, it's such a valuable contribution. And I wonder, where can people find this book and find more about the work that you do?
Sure. So you can, we love to support, buying from your local bookstore. I know, being in Australia, unfortunately, my book won't be in your local bookstore, but anybody who's listening today or in the future can find it at stonepeerpress.com. Or on my website, acadiatucker.com. You can order it from there as well. They make really good Christmas gifts.
Put the link down below. Yeah.
Since we're rounding into the holiday season. So absolutely. You could even find it on Amazon if that's your last resort as well.
Yeah. And maybe just mention a little bit about your co-author for this, and also that the Stone Peer Press is an interesting independent publisher that does good stuff as well. So do you want to just mention
check out, and we have new books in the pipeline. To speak about my co-author on this book, Emily Castle, she did an amazing job. She taught herself how to illustrate using the computer for this book. She's just a phenomenal, talented human, and it was just so great to have a partner this time going through the book process, because it is an arduous one. So to have a teammate there and the support was really fantastic. But as you mentioned, Stone Pier is, they only publish ecological books. So there's a great book if you're interested in turning your lawn into a meadow. There's some interesting cookbooks down the pipe. So it's definitely a website if you guys are interested in this kind of stuff to keep going back to. There's new articles popped up. So it is a really great resource for anything kind of regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, fantastic. And so your other books, so there's Growing Perennial Foods and also Growing Good Food, The Citizen's Guide to Backyard Carbon Farming, as well as your book, Tiny Gardens, Growing Good Food Without a Yard. And they're all available on Stone Pier Press. So we'll put the link below. Thank you so much for joining me again today, Acadia. It's been absolutely a delight to see you again and to hear about the new directions of your farming. The possibilities are endless now. You can be market gardening, you can be backyard gardening, or you can be indoor gardening, and you've got it all covered.
Well, and it's funny you say that. My newest adventure, which maybe one day there'll be a book about. I'm definitely taking a little bit of a break, but I'm kind of exploring the realm of seaweed farming, so ocean-based regenerative farming.
Oh, so I would love to find out more about that. So let us know when that comes out, and we'll get you back on the show to talk about seaweed farming. Fantastic. The other thing that I would like to experiment too would be doing sort of things like spirulina. A friend of mine who lives in an apartment in Nairobi grows spirulina in a fish tank in her living room. I thought, oh, that would be so fantastic.
Oh, I would love to chat with her. Yeah.
Yeah. So many possibilities in these tiny garden spaces and in spaces that we're not normally thinking about to grow food. And I think really putting our creative thinking caps on and our possibility of playing with it and experimenting with it. Yeah. And then sharing it as much as possible. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Acadia. It's been absolutely delightful to speak with you today, and I hope that you have a wonderful Christmas, and look forward to chatting again.
You too. Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to this Sense Making in a Changing World episode. I'm delighted to have been able to share this conversation with Acadia Tucker with you. Remember, check out the show notes for more links and leave a lovely review. Subscribe to get notification of our weekly podcast episodes. And thanks to the Permaculture Education Institute for supporting this show. Wishing you all the very best.